At the end of the last video, we asked the question, we first observed that there was a development of the invention of the teenager, a rise of youth culture in the United States in the 1950s. And then we left off by saying that R&B was an important influence in the development of rock and roll, but how is it that white teenagers actually got to hear rhythm and blues? Now you would say, well why not? I mean, why wouldn't it have been available to them? Well, think about it. Think about what we said before. We were living in a very segregated country back then. Some people would say we still are, but certainly we were living in a very segregated country back then. And rhythm and blues records were thought of as the music of Black America, of urban, mostly sort of urban African-American folks who were living in pretty close confines in one particular neighborhood in town. I mean, that gets into a whole other series of issues that have to do with American culture. But let's just accept that as having been. And for the white middle-class kids to go into that neighborhood would have been a real problem, not because they would have been so much in danger, but because their parents would not have allowed them to do so. There was a real divide. And so how is it that they would have come to hear that music if they couldn't go to the clubs where the music was being played, if they really couldn't get to the record store where those kinds of records were being sold because they weren't being sold in mainstream pop record stores that they might have had access to? How did they get to it? Well, one of the most important ways in which R&B came to young white teenagers, and it wasn't by intention. Nobody who was doing R&B at that time was trying to reach white teenagers in the first half of the 1950s. But one of the most important ways that it reached them was through radio. And this hooks into the story that we were telling last week about how it is that this large network of radio stations and a national audience was created by radio, developed up to the Second World War, and then after the Second World War, that national audience and a lot of the technology that went with it started to migrate to television, which was going to be the next big thing, leaving a fairly developed radio business there, but with a certain amount of attention being taken away from it nationally and being put into a television program at the national level. That opened up a lot of opportunities regionally, and so stations started to look at their region, think about opportunities for advertising, and some stations decided they would focus on rhythm and blues music and sell advertising that might appeal to the African American community. And so one of the important figures in rhythm and blues radio, in fact, in radio generally at this time, was the disc jockey. Now, I think I mentioned this last week, but it's important for us to realize that up until this time, the second half of the 1940s into the 1950s, playing a record on the radio was considered cheating. Anybody who heard music on the radio before then assumed that the music was live. So if you were playing a recording, it's like you were trying to trick the listener into believing you had an orchestra in your studio, in your station there, that you didn't actually have. And so there was a sort of sense of second-rate quality if you played records instead of live music. But with the rise of the disc jockey, records were played increasingly. It was seen as a very cheap alternative to live music. And for some stations that were sort of keeping an eye on the budget, this was they didn't go exclusively with disc jockeys, but they used disc jockeys more and more. And one of the important things about the disc jockey is the disc jockey had a lot of discretion in terms of which records they would play, which gave the disc jockey a certain amount of power. Some people would think it gave them the ability, especially in a regional station, to make a regional hit or not. And so they became very important figures in shaping the music as it began to develop. The statistics for this show that in 1947, for example, there were about 3,000 disc jockeys in this country. A handful of them were black disc jockeys, but most of them were white disc jockeys. And a lot of these white disc jockeys were on R&B stations playing music to African American listeners. Some of the important R&B stations that we should think about, especially with regard to rhythm and blues and the way that it spread, is WHBQ, which in 1949 launched Dewey Phillips's show Red Hot in Blue in Memphis. Dewey Phillips turns out to be the guy who helped launch the career of Elvis Presley in 1954. We'll talk about that in just a minute. That launched the career of Elvis Presley by playing his first record on his first son recording, That's All Right Mama. But then there was also Gene Nobles, John Rickborg, and Hoss Allen at WLAC in Nashville, Daddy Sears at WGST in Atlanta, and Hunter Hancock, who was a black DJ, at KFVD in Los Angeles. These guys were all doing R&B shows, usually in the evening, where they were playing all kinds of R&B records by independent labels. And they were really, if you were a young kid tuning the radio in, even though you couldn't get to the neighborhood where this music might have been played, by tuning it in on the radio, the music was available to you. And to a lot of these young teenagers, this was a very alluring thing. The world of R&B was a world of danger and forbidden sexuality and all the kinds of things that teenagers love. And the fact that their parents would have been very, very upset if they knew they were listening to it made it all the more appealing. After all, teenagers have always been teenagers, and they certainly were back then. The most important of all the R&B DJs, the guy who really sort of towers above the rest in terms of influence and importance, was Alan Freed. And Alan Freed really became a kind of celebrity, national celebrity in and of himself. In fact, he became one of the biggest targets at the end of the decade when the payola scandal started to come in, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Anyway, Alan Freed, by the time he launches his show called The Moondog Show in July of 1951 at WJW in Cleveland, by the time he's doing that, these other DJs had already been doing that kind of thing. So it wasn't like he invented this kind of a show. Other people had been doing it, but Freed did it in a way that really began to pick up some real attention. He was initially sponsored by a fellow named Leo Mintz, who in Cleveland owned one of the biggest record stores called Record Rendezvous. And Leo Mintz had been sponsoring a classical music show, because of course classical records sold pretty well back in those days, had been sponsoring a classical show on the same station. But at 11 o'clock, after I guess they thought most decent people had gone to bed, they decided to put on this show devoted to R&B music. So in other words, the station that Alan Freed was initially on was doing classical music until 11 o'clock. Then at 11 o'clock he comes on with the R&B. And Alan Freed, for all intents and purposes, sounded like he was a black DJ. He was doing a lot of things like, pounding on phone books and all excited in his delivery and all the kinds of things that we came to expect from AM DJs later. He was doing all of that stuff, and very effectively. Most of his listeners were surprised to find out that Alan Freed was actually white. People would come to the station, they say, Al, who are you? I'm Alan Freed. I thought you were black. This kind of thing. And so Leo Mintz helps get this thing started, and they don't really know it, but in this period between 1951 and 1953 in Cleveland, there are a lot of white kids tuning in to this. Now, how would they ever know? Well, one story is that this kids started coming in to the store and buying the R&B records, but it probably didn't happen that way. Probably the way they really found out about it is Alan Freed, an entrepreneur always interested in making a little bit of extra money, starts to put concerts together where he brings all of these R&B groups together. A concert like that would be like a package show, 5 or 6 different groups, put them on at a big theater in Cleveland, and all of a sudden all these kids show up who are both black and white, and they're together at the same show. Now that wouldn't raise much of an eyebrow today, but back then, the white power structure that was in charge of these kinds of things didn't think that was good. In fact, in some theaters, the black patrons and the white patrons couldn't even be in the same part of the theater. The black attendees would have to be in the balcony, say, for example, and the white kids on the main floor. But they started to sort of blend together, and this was seen as very dangerous. Rock and roll from the very beginning was seen as a kind of a dangerous influence. So these black and white kids coming together at these shows, a scandal. Well, Alan Freed has so much success in Cleveland that he moves to the Big Apple, to New York, to WINS, and has to change the name of his show, The Moondog Show, to the Rock and Roll Party, I think, as I said last week, because there was a panhandler in New York who called himself the Moondog and actually took him to court about it. So the Rock and Roll Party launches in September of 1954, and he's on doing this show in the biggest radio market in the world, New York City. And so he makes a tremendous impact there. Eventually, that show of his, The Alan Freed Show, goes into syndication nationally, so people get to hear him all over the country. He does shows just like he'd been doing in Cleveland, but now he does tours where The Alan Freed Show goes around from city to city, that kind of thing. He did a bunch of movies. They were really sort of flimsy plots with just an opportunity for you to see lip-sync performances of some of the early rock and roll performers, but for that they're great. Rock Around the Clock from '56, Rock, Rock, Rock from 1956, and Don't Knock the Rock from 1957. So as an important figure in sort of championing the cause of early rock and roll, Alan Freed is an important figure and probably the most important DJ for us to think about. Let's turn our attention now to indie labels and early rock and roll. We said before, last week, that the major labels of this era, Decca, Mercury, RCA, Victor, Columbia, Capitol, and MGM, really were the ones that had all the money and had all the wherewithal to very quickly and efficiently distribute their records nationally. An independent label was a small company with limited distribution. You could distribute your records about as far as you could get if you put them in your trunk and drove to each place. I mean, that's basically the way it was for a lot of indie labels. There was one, maybe two guys working there, and really distribution was about taking the records out to the jukebox providers, to the radio stations trying to get the songs on the air, and to the record stores, and that's the way it worked. And so it really limited these guys in a lot of kinds of ways, so they kept their focus low. Now that's okay, because the major labels really didn't want this other business in R&B and country and western so much because it was just too small potatoes for them. They were making the big money in mainstream pop, and they were happy with that. But these indie label owners, they really had to work hard to promote their records. After all, it was their money that was on the line. If you worked for a major label, you were really spending the company's money. But if you had an independent label, you were spending your money. And so it made a lot more difference. So these guys would really go at promoting these records. And in the record business, this meant sometimes what came to be called payola. That is, you would try to do something nice for a DJ who had, as I said before, all this discretion about what to play or not to play. Do something nice for him to convince him to play your record and not somebody else's. Sometimes that would be a cash gift. Sometimes it would just be a gift, maybe a case of whiskey, something like that. Sometimes it would be a paid vacation. There are all kinds of ways you can think of that you could offer somebody something to do a favor for you. And everybody was doing it. The majors were doing it too, but the indies were really aggressive about it and really going after it. So what ends up happening is these indie records start to cross over onto the mainstream pop charts, as we talked about in 19. We'll talk in a minute when we talk about crossover about what the figures were. But when these things start to cross over from the R&B charts, which was thought of as sort of small potatoes, we don't care about that by the majors, onto the mainstream pop label, well, then they started to cut in to the major labels' market share. Then they were a lot more concerned about that. And then the race was really on in rock and roll to see who could garner the greater market share and who could be more successful. So before we can talk about that, let's talk in the next video about how crossover works.